Bonjour, bonjour, and welcome to episode 4 of Paris in Bleu Blanc Rouge. Today, I am excited to share a once in a lifetime, in many of a lifetimes, event that is going on in Paris this week only until Sunday. It is under the beautiful glass and iron roof of the Grand Palais, and it is something that really nobody has ever seen before. So it's really exciting. It was announced a little over a month ago that this was going to happen. And of course, I was there first thing on the very first morning to be able to view this. And I was really excited. And while I was looking at it, I just was overwhelmed with the vast area that this was covering and had to look into more of it. So I spent the last couple of days going deep, deep, deep down into this project and found out even something maybe I really didn't want to know, but I will share that with you and all of the details. So right now, until February 8th in the Grand Palais is the carpets that were created for the Louvre to cover the entire area of the Grand Gallery. And I'll tell you all about that. These were created in the 17th century. They stretched out in the Grand Palais under the 650-foot-long nave. 31 of these 93 carpets that were intended for the Louvre, created under Charles le Brun and under Louis XIV, are there for you to see. And it is massive. I will put pictures on my website, and also make sure you're following me on Instagram, because I'll put some pictures and also some videos. And it's almost, they're so big, you really can't even take them all in from the ground. But what's amazing is you could go up above the balcony in the Grand Palais and look down on them. And there's just so much of them. And we only see 31 of 93. So when you see pictures of this and videos, think of this as 3 times as long. So to go back a little farther, we'll start with Louis XII, died on May 14th in 1643, which is the same date as his father, Henry IV, who died on May 14th, 1610. Louis XIV was just 4 years old and unable to rule until he turned 13. In 1661, his coronation was held in Reims in the Champagne region, a site we will also see that's under the Grand Palais in a tapestry. It was raised with the taste of the good life. Louis wanted to be surrounded by beauty everywhere he went. After his father's death, he grew up in the Palais Cardinal, today's Palais Royal, which is far more contemporary than the dilapidated Louvre. After the Fronde and escape from Paris, he returned to restore the Louvre to the palace it deserved to be. The Louvre of the 17th century was much smaller than it is today. The fortress and the palace of the Middle Ages was removed by Francois I, and the current Louvre began to take shape with his son Henry II in the 16th century. Since then, each king or emperor added a bit here and there. Louis XIV was no different and added the rest of the Salon Carré wing and the colonnade, although he fled Paris without putting a roof on it, but that's a story for another day. Inside, he had the lavish apartments created for his mother, Anne of Austria, the Apollo Gallery above it, and the adjoining Palais des Tuileries was also largely enhanced by Louis XIV. The route to reach it from the Louvre was in need of its own little glow-up. The Galerie de Bordelot, as it was originally known, was added by Henry IV to join the two palaces together so the royal family and the court could avoid the weather as they walked between the two. It stretches above the Seine, covering 457 meters, 1,500 feet, and is over a quarter of a mile long. Henry IV began building it in 1595 and finally completed it in 1610, just before his death. Henry wanted the walls covered with landscape paintings of the French countryside by Jacques Fouquier, but that would never come to fruition. As a child, Henry's son Louis XIII learned to hunt in the Long Gallery, where they brought in a horse, dogs, foxes, and at one point, even a camel was found galloping through the never-ending corridor. On rainy days, he tied a small carriage to his dogs that raced him to the Tuileries. In 1641, the ceiling of the corridor was to be embellished by French artist Nicolas Poussin and architect Jacques Lemercier with the stories of Hercules, a figure that plays an important role in the story of the Bourbon kings. Poussin ran into one hurdle after another, many self-inflicted, and returned to Rome, and the project was abandoned. 21 years later, in 1662, Jean-Baptiste Colbert sent a sealed and private request to the Ministry of the Marine asking for a very large carpet, specifically a Turkish-style hand-knotted carpet. The Turkish rugs were more durable and made with wool and linen and a bit more plush than the Persian style. Colbert never received the carpet, so he created his own. An initial order placed in August of 1662 for 13 carpets to fill the floor at the Petite Galerie, which is later the Galerie des Palais, was just the beginning. The next year, in 1663, Louis XIV created the Garde Meuble and named Gideon Barbier de Metz as its guardian. The action, in turn, put a greater importance on all the treasures of the crown. The furnishings of the many chateaux and palaces, furniture, tapestries, and even the crown jewels all fell into this important category. It was then that the Palais du Louvre finally moved to the top of the list and in need of its own revitalization. In 1668, Louis XIV resumed the project abandoned by his father to recreate and restore sections of the damage done during the Fronde and the fire of 1661. Architect Louis Laveau used the designs of Poussin and added his own touch and handed over to a team of sculptors and artists to embellish the ceilings and walls of the Bordelais. In 1668, the most ambitious of all the projects was created and intended to cover the entire length with carpets. Jean-Baptiste Colbert orchestrated the king's idea and offered his own vision and commissioned the largest single carpet order in Europe. Colbert dictated the size of the carpets, but left the rest to the painter and decorator Charles le Brun. Le Brun created the concept and instructed multiple artists who designed each of the over 80 carpets, as a few were used as duplicates. Baudouin, Yvar, and François Francard came up with the overall design and theme under the instruction of Le Brun. Other artists, including Nicolas Bernier, Jean Lemoyer, a.k.a. Le Lorrain, Jean-Baptiste Monnier, and Peter Boll, worked on the animals, fruit, and flowers, while Abraham Jaunoy painted each of the landscapes. Each carpet involved a large central compartment with architectural borders, and on either side a cartouche that included a landscape scene or a bas-relief cameo of an allegory in light pink, ochre, or pale blue. Virtues of the king, including authority, tolerance, fortune, vigilance, and peace, all depicted by allegories, religious virtues as well as love, hope, and generosity, and the four elements, air, wind, earth, and fire, were just some of the subjects. Carpet number 46, Earth, is one of my favorites and is on display at the Grand Palais. With the four corners of the world in the center, a globe is surrounded by animals that represent each of these four parts. A horse for Europe, a camel for Asia, a crocodile for the Americas, and an elephant for Africa. On either end, Ceres, the goddess of architectures, on one side, and Bacchus, the god of wine, on the other. However, this one also holds a hidden treasure that can't be seen in any of the other carpets. In each of the corners, the artist added a snake that is winding his way around an acanthus leaves, ready to attack this sweet little squirrel. Nicolas Fouquet, the superintendent of finances, was the richest man in France. He had even more money than the king. He married well twice and absorbed vast fortunes as well as his own family money. On August 17, 1661, Fouquet threw a little soirée of his own at his newly built Chateau Vaux-le-Vicomte and invited his boss, Louis XIV, to attend. Louis had already visited twice, but this time he arrived with more than 600 people as well as Jean-Baptiste Colbert. Fouquet wanted to impress the king, and he pulled out all the stops, including fireworks, fountains, the finest cuisine of the day by Francois Vatel. Molière was there presenting his poem Le Fauchot for the first time, and Jean de La Fontaine read his many fables. The beautiful chateau was designed by architect Louis Laveau, painted by Charles le Brun, and the gardens designed by André Le Nôtre. Colbert was so distraught, he started to lay the suspicion with the king that the only way he could afford this would have been by stealing from the royal coffers. On September 5th, 1661, the king's birthday, Colbert had Fouquet arrested and all his property seized. Louis XIV even took his artist that designed his home. It's no small coincidence that the plans for the Chateau de Versailles exploded at this point and became much more elaborate. The coat of arms of the Fouquet family is a single squirrel, Fouquet meaning squirrel in Old French. And you guessed it, the coat of arms of Jean-Baptiste Colbert was that of a snake. Colbert having that added into the carpet. Colbert had this added into the carpet that sat at the very center of the Grand Gallery. He took this fight up to the level, at the highest level you could possibly get by having it immortalized in a carpet, his hatred that he had for Fouquet. And now we could all see it today, but not many people would notice it. While some of the carpets have cameos and allegories and of the virtues and the many other depictions of the king, the ones that had landscapes were created, but not of any specific place that I could find. I've done a ton of research, but supposedly a book is being written about all of these carpets, and I can't wait to get my hands on it if that's true. At the time, the Grand Gallery stood on its own and stretched out over the Seine, with windows lining the entire corridor. Under Napoleon III, additions were added, including where the Mona Lisa is, that actually closes off the outer windows of part of the Grand Gallery. In the 17th century, the only source of light was from these windows on either side. The windows above us, when you walk through, were added in the 19th century. The intention was that the royal court could stroll down the gallery, taking in the sights along the way. The Seine below one window and what was actually many homes on the courtyard side. However, if Henry IV had his wish, the walls would have been covered in the landscapes of France. Once the designs were finished, it was time to construct this monumental project. The process of the carpets was inspired by the Turkish and Eastern weaving techniques. On a vertical upright loom, two massive fir trees held the yarn for two layers of wool warp threads that went top to bottom. Each row of knots is secured with the colored weft linen thread that goes through horizontally, weaving its way through the two layers, creating the scene. They are all then compacted together, creating a tight and secure design, then cut with angle scissors, creating a dense pile. It was under Hot Legs Henry, as I affectionately call him, that the art of weaving tapestry and carpets arrived in Paris. Seeing the success in Italy and in Lyon, he wished to establish the art of silks, furniture making, and tapestries in Paris. First, he established the eastern area of the Marais to allow factories to build, but few came. Next was to find artisans he could bring in to build the craft at his feet. In 1608, Pierre Dupont, who claimed he was trained in the art of making Turkish and Levantine-style rugs, was named the carpet maker of the king. His atelier was established on the ground floor of the Louvre, just below the Grand Gallery itself. Henry loved his designs so much that he kept them all for himself and requested more than Pierre could keep up with. Teaching his craft to students, an exceptionally adapted young man, Simon Lourdes, showed a talent for weaving. Members of the court would visit their atelier and marvel at the designs, thinking they were looking at a painting. Dupont and Lourdes continued working the atelier after the death of the king. Marie de Medicis, now regent for her young son, Louis XIII, wanted to establish and grow the industry. And in 1626, Marie names Simon Lourdes as his official carpet maker and set up a large atelier for him in the former soap factory along the Seine, a short walk from the Louvre. Dupont was enraged and took it as a betrayal. Fights, public disputes, and lawsuits continued until the two died and carried out through their sons. That they each took over the ateliers. The manufacturer Savonnière, established in 1628, moved into a former soap factory on the hill of Shiloh, where the Palais de Tokyo and the Museum of Modern Art is today. Under Marie de Medici, it had been turned into an orphanage after the soap factory had left, and then when a large space was needed for the Lode Atelier, it was a perfect location with built-in workforce. Now, there are a few times when I'm doing research and I go really deep into a subject, I find out things I wish I didn't know. The real and unvarnished truth of the life of Chanel, Gertrude Stein, and Simone de Beauvoir, to name a few, and my dislike for these three runs very deep. And now we can add this little gem of a fact about Marie de Medici. I covered her in the old podcast many years ago and update a story about her again soon when we talk about the amazing paintings in the Louvre. But let's just say this wasn't one of her finest moments, but she wasn't known for being a wonderful woman or a loving mother for that sake. And now we could add another layer. To bring these massive tapestries to life, many hands were needed, shall we say little hands. Supplied by the Hôpital Général, orphans between the ages of 9 to 13 worked and trained, as they called apprentices, in return for housing, feeding, and clothing them. Marie thought it was a great idea to keep the orphan children from entertaining a life of begging or crime. At any point over the 20 years it took to fulfill this order of 93 carpets for the Grand Gallery, as well as 13 for the Galerie des Palais, more than 50 weavers worked at one time. A later report established in 1713 looked at the same period as 1664 to 1673, which covered part of the creation of the carpets. 283 children escaped or died. In 1671, with both the Dupont and the Lorde descendants now in charge of each other's atelier, and the family war was over, the two joined together in the Savonnière to continue work on the Grand Gallery carpets. After the death of Simon Lorde, his son Philippe had taken the helm, and after his death in 1719, his wife Jeanne Haffray Lorde led the way, and under her leadership, 65 of the 93 carpets were created, and a majority of what you see in this very special exhibit. It took over 20 years to finish this monumental task in 1689. Louis XIV left Paris in 1682, moving his entire court to Versailles. The carpets were all but forgotten and no longer needed. They never arrived at the Louvre or were rolled out into the Grand Gallery. Louis XIV and later his grandson Louis XV used them as diplomatic gifts, scattering them around Europe and Asia. In 1789, during the Revolution, many were sold, given away, or cut up, or just lost and forgotten. Napoleon revitalized the Gobelins and wanted to bring back the French grandeur. While few could afford to have large tapestries and carpets made, the emperor kept the looms moving with new orders and restoration of the many carpets of the Sun King. He found and purchased where they could return home, at least in France, if not the Grand Gallery. Over time, they have been used in Élysée Palace, in the private and public spaces, multiple French embassies around Europe, and other government offices. Today, the Manufacture Nationale has 41 in the collection, including 8 fragments. Carpets that big need a very large space to spread out, and when the carpets were gifted or sold, many were sadly cut up to accommodate smaller spaces. Carpets today are also scattered in museums and some private collections. The Musée Camadot has number 15 that represents air, one of the 4 elements. The center includes 4 winds blowing trumpets, and on either end, in the bas-reliefs, Juno and Helios, the god of wind. Since 2023, the tapestries has undergone an intense study to look at their iconography, provenance, and current state for restoration. If you missed this once-in-a-lifetime exhibit this week, you could see 2 within the Louvre. Both should return to display after the exhibit. You could find them in Salle 602 and 603 on the first floor of the Sully wing. Also on display are 14 tapestries of the life of the Sun King created in one of the carpets of the Apollo Gallery. More on those next week. The exhibit runs until February 8th, is free, but a ticket is needed. There's plenty still available. It's open every day at 10 a.m. till 7:30 on Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday, and Saturday, and until midnight this Friday, the 6th, and until 4 p.m. on Sunday, the 8th. If you're coming to Paris this week, I definitely suggest going to see it. It is amazing, and it's not incredibly crowded. It's mostly all French visitors that are visiting it and checking it all out. Because again, like I said, nobody has ever seen this many of these together and laid all out, because they never did go to the Grand Gallery. I can't imagine had those ever been laid today in the Grand Gallery, which is one of the busiest parts of the Louvre because it leads into the room of the Mona Lisa. Those would just be ruined as the more than 30,000 people a day walk that corridor to get to the Mona Lisa. And after doing all of this, I don't think I'll ever look at a carpet the same way twice, knowing the artistry that goes into making these and how much time. I mean, when these were created, each one took over 10 years to make, with all those, little hands again working on them. It takes an incredibly long time. It's pretty much the same way that you make a tapestry, which also takes a long time, which I've also shared on the last podcast about the tapestries in Notre Dame. And when the new ones are created for Notre Dame, which will probably be in about 8 years, we'll share all of that information as well. But you can see tapestries hanging in Notre Dame. But the carpets themselves, there are a few that are in the Louvre, including the one from the Apollo Gallery. And you can't, of course, walk on these, but you can get a good view of what these actually look like, and they're amazing. There's also another one added into the Louvre, just past the Appartement Napoléon III, that was from the throne room of the Tuileries under Louis XVIII. It is amazing, has also been restored, and you can really get a pretty up-close look at that and look at the design that goes into these. Way back when in the 16th century, when they were first thinking of these carpets, nobody really had these carpets because people, there was no sidewalks, there was no streets. It was everything was mud and gunk and horses out there and everything else that was in the ground. So, hopefully people back then had the no shoes in the house policy, because it would have been just horrible. So carpets were intended at first, a lot of them were put up on walls, just like tapestries. And then later on in the 16th century, they started looking at them. But this was only put in very, very special places. And people didn't, not many people actually had them. And you would find them in palaces, which, think of that now today when, pretty much every house has carpets in it, wall-to-wall carpet. But it's pretty amazing. And I remember when I was a kid at the time, those, what were they, I want to say latchkey, but that's not it. The latch hook rugs. Does anybody remember those? And I love those. And I remember creating one of those and just thought it was the coolest thing. So maybe that'll come back. All of these, as we call grandma hobbies, which, I love, are coming back in vogue. Maybe they'll bring back the latch hook rugs too. But my tip for this week, if you're coming to Paris and you're coming this spring, especially in April, just make sure you plan ahead. I kind of always gauge things too on requests for my private tours that I give, which I only give a few every week. But my requests for April, from mid-April to beginning of May, are crazy, to the point where I think that everybody is traveling to Paris. But it's always a really great indication of bookings as far as how many people are wanting to come to Paris at that time. It is definitely busier this year than it has been in the past, even at this time of the year when it's usually nice and quiet. But April is shaping up to be incredibly busy. So even if you're not booking a private tour with me, which contact me if you want to, but This is just your reminder to book those things that you really want to see. I don't believe that you should pack your schedule with things to do and break it down by hours. I know people that do that, and that's, if that's the way you like to travel, go for it. But like I said, I think in the first episode, plan one thing for your morning, one thing for your afternoon. But if it is something that you really, really want to see, like a visit to my beautiful and amazing Louvre, do book those tickets in advance. Anything you really want to see, book in advance if you can, because then there's not going to be some horrible issue and you miss it. So book tickets for things like the Louvre, the Orsay, and even the Orangerie these days. For the last year and a half, that place has gone bonkers, and you have to have that ticket in advance. Other things to try to get in advance is the Eiffel Tower, but you also don't necessarily have to. If you want to go early in the morning, go later in the evening, and you usually can walk right in. And also be aware of ticket scams online. If you can, book everything directly, and be careful. If you Google Louvre tickets, you most likely are not going to be taken to the Louvre website. You're going to go to a fancy website that looks like you're buying the Louvre, and they're going to charge you sometimes 2 or 3 times higher than the Louvre tickets are, and you're getting nothing with that. And then sometimes you get inside the Louvre and they don't work. But so just make sure you're going directly to the actual website, like the Louvre.fr, or, the Eiffel Tower. That's another huge one where there's so many scams out there. And you just don't want to have that ruin your vacation. So make sure you're booking things directly through the actual websites of the museums. For the most part, those are the 3 big ones that you kind of want to have your tickets in advance. And even the Orsay, depending on what's going on, there's a huge Rodin, or not, Renoir. I always do that. Renoir exhibit coming up in March. That's going to be pretty big. So that will get busy. And sometimes it's just depending on the day of the week. You definitely want to have those tickets in advance if you possibly can, because they do sell out. These places normally do have some on-site tickets, but you could wait in a very long line for the Louvre. I've seen that line probably be at least 250 people waiting to get in, and so you could wait a good hour or 2. So you don't want to waste your time in a line. So that is my big suggestion, especially for the spring. If you need any help planning your time in Paris, reach out to me, because I actually also do that. I could do a customized plan specifically just for you on what you want to do and how you want to do it. So reach out to me. Also, make sure you check my website, ClaudineHemingway.com, for all of that, and also for photos and some images about what I just shared with you, all about the carpets of the Sun King. And I will be back next week with a little bit more about the Galerie des Palais, which has made a lot of news the last 4 months since the theft, but it's also the anniversary of an event that changed it in 1661 and began to be what we see and know it as today. So it's so great sharing all of this with you, and I hope to see all of you soon, and see you next week.